I learned a great deal over the weekend during the latest Yellow Vest protest in Dublin. It began at the Custom House Quay and concluded with a march through town all the way to Grafton Street for a sit-down protest. There, the crowd chanted to the general public to take off their masks, and some people actually did. It felt like we were truly piercing the bubble of mainstream public consciousness. The reactions from the public ranged from supportive to confused, disapproving, and all the way to outright disgust. I saw more than one mask wearer walking by shaking their head with utter contempt for us, as if they were repulsed by the very sight of another human being without a mask on. Maybe they were infuriated that there's some people out there who genuinely don't think like they do. It's extraordinary how human beings can be so comprehensively reprogrammed in just a few short months that suddenly wearing a mask becomes second nature to them. It's like 1984. We've always been at war with COVID-19. We've always worn masks. They've truly fallen for the insidious anti-human agenda of brainwashing the populace into being disgusted by their own humanity and the humanity of others. It's a very dangerous precedent. So much so, they now see another person walking towards them as a disgusting bag of toxic bio-waste. Everyone seems to have obsessive-compulsive disorder. Everyone seems to be a germaphobe, engaged in a pattern of ritualistic behaviors that are fundamentally based on paranoia and irrational fear. The left goes on and on about how everyone who disagrees with them and their talking points is, for example, homophobic or transphobic, Islamophobic or xenophobic, whatever. It's ironic then that the globalists and the media have convinced most of the hypnotized masses to be genuinely afraid of their own species, which is humophobia. Humophobia is rife in Dublin, which is the fear of other human beings. A number of us got into conversation with some mask wearers. I listened to their concerns, and it did give me a new appreciation for where their minds are at. The young people especially are on autopilot. It's interesting to consider the Zoomer generation and the younger millennials who grew up being naturally pro-government because they were put into daycare, and from a very young age, they became accustomed to having an authority figure that wasn't their parents, and they were indoctrinated, of course, in the school system throughout their young lives. They don't fear authority, they are a product of authority. So, following government orders blindly feels intuitive and natural to them. They're in a state of arrested development. They will always feel somewhat infantilized by the state. On the opposite side of the spectrum, there are the boomers, the older generation, who I find are fearful of authority. They respect doctors, politicians, news presenters, and scientists as if they were high priests of a religion. They treat them with unquestioning trust and reverence. So that's two different generations on either side of the spectrum, two different motivations for what is ultimately the same outcome: blind obedience to authority. One young woman told me how she wore the mask because she was afraid that if she was talking to someone without a mask on, that a drop of saliva could fly from her mouth accidentally and hit someone. This is something that happens to all of us at some point in our lives. It's kind of one of those occasionally embarrassing aspects of being human. Sometimes we're speaking, maybe in a pub with a couple of drinks on us, and perhaps you're talking loudly and a random projectile of spit flies out of your mouth. The phrase, "say it, don't spray it," comes to mind. But to be suddenly petrified of such an outcome is to become as paranoid and neurotic as someone who is obsessed about not standing on the cracks on the street pavement. Other people told me how they or someone they loved had underlying conditions. I had to explain to them that the mask would not only reduce their immune systems by making them rebreathe their own CO2, as well as microbacteria on the inside of the mask, but I told them of the actual fatality numbers from the virus, the fact that the vast majority die not just from some minor underlying conditions, but from multiple comorbidities, and that the median age of death is 84. Some reactions were better than others. I found some people were at least willing to consider what I was saying. I suppose that was positive. But of course, it's always next to impossible to red pill someone in real time. All you can do is plant a seed. The most important thing to remember is this. In a divide and conquer situation, the establishment thrives when two different sides simplify each other because it becomes easier to demonize someone. So the mask wearers have a simple idea in their minds as to who the anti-lockdown, anti-mask people are. They think we are irresponsible, reckless, and selfish tinfoil hat-wearing conspiracy theorists who refuse to listen to the science. And our side believes that the mask wearers who buy into the narrative are zombie-like sheep who blindly believe everything that the mainstream media and the government tell them. So the challenge for us is to try to empathize with them and meet them where they are. We shouldn't shout at them about how they're sheep, zombies, morons, etc. We shouldn't become confrontational, even if it's frustrating to see how asleep they are. We want them to wake up faster, of course, but I'm afraid if we try to push them, they'll get their backs up, and then they'll become defensive, even to the point of defending the masks and the government restrictions, etc. So we have to be gentle with them, acknowledge that we understand that they put on the mask and obeyed the restrictions because they were concerned about their loved ones and the elderly, and were afraid of getting them sick. So from their point of view, complying with the rules was a good thing. We then have to explain that we too would never want to jeopardize the health and well-being of their loved ones, let alone our own loved ones. And the reason that we're against the restrictions is because we have analysed the data being used to justify them, and we have reached different conclusions. We must also explain that there is clear evidence that lockdowns and masks will lead to greater long-term harms for society, that essentially the cure is worse than the disease. We can talk about how more people will die of suicide and delayed cancer treatments, etc. We have to remain calm, fact-based and unemotional. Now, since this happened, the National Public Health Emergency Team has basically recommended that the government put Ireland back into nationwide level 5 lockdown. So as predicted, a second lockdown is being suggested. Case numbers are increasing from increased testing, of course, but death numbers remain on the floor and nothing out of the ordinary for this time of year. The Irish government has decided to reject this advice and instead do to the entire country what's already being done to Dublin. Place everywhere in level 3. Ivor Cummins has brilliantly explained in his videos the case-demic phenomenon.
So case-demics, we've had this hysteria in the UK and Ireland and all over Europe actually from June to September 2020. And a case-demic, quite simply, can be shown here. In a real epidemic, you have cases rising and falling by the viral curve, largely independent of lockdowns. And now we have, coming into autumn, cases rising rapidly. But a lot of these are due to false positives, which we'll discuss in a moment. But let's look at the deaths. In the real epidemic, they rose, sadly. The susceptible were affected. But the epidemic was over, really, in May 2020. Let's look now at the impacts in a case-demic. And as you can see, you can barely see them. There's still less than one person per million per day with a positive PCR test sadly passing. So that's a case-demic. This is a very important article, and there are many now, on false positives from the PCR test. So I'll explain. Here we have the epidemic back in March, April. UK is in purple there. That was indeed an epidemic and very sad impacts. Out here at the end of May coming into June, it's no longer an epidemic by any reasonable definition because the impacts are falling right down. But if you keep testing with PCR tests, as the authorities seem to have been pushing, you'll get yourself a case-demic, which we indicated a few minutes ago. Let's look at the PCR tests. If you're doing 10,000 PCR tests in a day, and the UK is doing 250,000, but let's say 10,000, and you get 100 positives, that's kind of scary. And feed these all in, and you got a case-demic. But what if we were scientific, and we thought about the actual data and the science? Well, then we'd realise that 50 to 90 of these, 100, could be false positives at a sensitivity of 99.2%. That's just the math. Another bunch are old fragments of virus from maybe an infection a month or more ago, so they're meaningless as well. You could have trivial positives, genuine fragments of virus, but no transmissibility, and they're going to be gone in a couple of weeks without any transmission, so they're trivial, they don't count for anything. And you will have some concerning positives in there at a very low rate of people who are transmissible or symptomatic and may be relevant. This is the number that should be taken out from the 100 and fed in to the tracking to look at preventative measures if necessary. Then you wouldn't have a case-demic though, really, would you? So you got to ask the question of your authorities, because they're using all 100 here inappropriately. Why are they doing this? There were 12,000 tests done per day back in the actual epidemic in the UK, and now there's around 250,000 a day. That's one huge driver for the case-demic. More than 20 times more testing than April. In terms of cases, there were 700 back here when the tracking started July. These are PCR positives being called cases, but they're not cases. As I mentioned to you, they're PCR positives, viral fragments. Cases are people who are symptomatic or hospitalised. So that's a big obfuscation. But anyway, it's up to 7,100 of these so-called cases. So that's very scary. Let's remove now and look at the impact again, coincident with all of these cases. And we can see that almost nothing is happening. Around 0.6 deaths per million people per day in the UK carrying some viral fragments.
The case-demic situation is happening across Europe right now, including in Ireland, and increased PCR testing, which is rife with false positives and also detects fragments of dead coronaviruses that most people have, as well as immunity for COVID-19. This is what's being used to justify the curtailment of some of the most basic human rights. By the way, in the UK, flu and pneumonia killed 10 times more Brits than coronavirus again last week. With the fear of a second lockdown now an ongoing threat that can be wheeled out whenever the government wants to terrify the public back into submission, I'm already hearing that more shops and other private businesses are going to enforce masks more stringently. You'll likely see more people buying into the narrative out of fear because they're even more demoralised and they're desperate to try to appease the government. They believe that if they behave like good boys and girls and do what the teacher tells them, that they won't get detention. This once again factors into what John Anthony was talking about in my previous video. The Irish public are basically in an abusive relationship with the government. They're like the pleaser housewife who is desperate for validation from her abusive narcissistic husband, which, of course, she never gets. The bullying, abandonment, and torment is then followed by periods of mercy, which the appeaser incorrectly interprets as love and empathy. But the narcissist can never empathize, let alone feel love. He only wants to dominate and control. Likewise, at the macro level, this government has a similar MO. Torture people with lockdowns, delay cancer treatments, torment and terrorize with constant fear-mongering, restrict freedoms, take people's bodily autonomy away, and then offer what appears to be leniency. The opening up after the summer was nothing but a temporary reprieve after the torture of lockdown, to lull the public into a false sense of safety and hope, while currying their favour and trust. Each time a lockdown happens, it's followed by a slight reopening and backing off period, followed by another, worse lockdown, where more and more rights and freedoms are chipped away. Alternatively, they can demonstrate the levels of control they have over society through intimidation and threats. By occasionally dangling a full level 5 lockdown over the heads of the public, they can appear merciful and benevolent by going instead with a level 3. This makes the public breathe a sigh of relief, just like the victim who finds that their abuser is suddenly acting nice to them today. The Irish public may direct some of their ire at the anti-lockdown protesters, though of course they were silent when the BLM protests took place in Dublin. But in truth, the reason for their misdirected rage is because, on some unconscious level, some of them know that the real threat to their liberties is coming directly from the government, not the anti-lockdown protesters, and certainly not a virus that's less deadly than a seasonal flu. Viruses can't pass legislation, and appeasement never works. Wearing the star didn't stop the persecution of the Jewish people during the Holocaust, and likewise, wearing a face mask and complying with mandates and lockdowns won't bring back people's rights and freedoms. By the way, the misreporting on death certificates that I covered back in April, well, it's now starting to surface on mainstream news in Ireland.
To Dr. Cudahy. Dr. Cudahy, if somebody who is asymptomatic shows no symptoms whatsoever of COVID and they have a heart attack and are brought to hospital and they're tested and it is found that they have COVID and they die soon thereafter, but this is somebody who's demonstrated no symptoms whatsoever. Are they recorded as a COVID death or not? If they have tested positive for COVID, but ultimately came to hospital because they've had a heart attack or a stroke or fallen off the roof of a building or something like that?
We adhere to the World Health Organization case definition in terms of the recording and reporting of deaths. So in the situation that you describe, where someone has a positive COVID test, then it is a death in a confirmed COVID case. But such a case would be subject to a coroner's report as well. And as part of the ongoing validation of the data in our surveillance system, we would take additional details in relation to such.
Okay, but a coroner's report, sorry, I'm trying to be very brief. Obviously, a coroner's report takes a very long time to make its way through the system. So for now, they are recorded as a COVID death, but it may be that they are taken off that list at a later date. Is that what you're saying?
That's it, exactly.
Dying with COVID and not dying from COVID. You know the usual. And yet it seems to make no difference in the minds of Irish people. So all of the months of fear-mongering in the media is justified based on large numbers of death figures that aren't accurate and can later be modified retroactively. Moving on, the inhumanity and insensitivity to human suffering is almost at psychotic levels at this point. This video is of a funeral service in the UK. As Darren Grimes explains, a son moves his chair next to his mother to comfort her at the funeral of her late husband. A member of staff says they've been told and asked to separate. It really does highlight the cruel lack of humanity and decency in the way in which we're forced to live our lives today.
It's my privilege to have been asked to conduct our service today to celebrate the life of Alan Wright. I therefore offer you all a very warm welcome as we unite in love and friendship to
What a truly sick and demented world we live in. You cannot tell me that all that's missing here is some common sense and access to the correct data about the seriousness of this virus. There's a lot more missing here than that. The heart and soul of humanity is entirely absent. This is not how God intended us to live. A cold world with no empathy, compassion, and love. It's not a place that's conducive to living in. It's a world to simply exist in and die in pain, loneliness, and atomization. Now next up, as Belarusian President Alexander Lukashenko revealed, the IMF and World Bank offered him a bribe to introduce lockdowns, curfews, mandatory masks, and to crash the economy of Belarus. He refused, and by going public about this, he gave the world an insight into the real reason that all of these draconian measures have been pushed on the people. The Great Reset is nearly upon us. You have probably heard the slogan "Build Back Better" in the rhetoric of Joe Biden or even recently Boris Johnson. Build back better. You're going to hear a lot about that. It appears to refer to one of the Great Reset's primary initiatives, the reordering of society, the economy, all industry and infrastructure, in order to bring about the climate change agenda and massively reduce CO2 emissions. I should point out, of course, reducing human CO2 levels to zero will result in absolute poverty and starvation. Everything that humans do produces CO2, and that's why the genocidal climate change fanatics are so obsessed with it. It ensures that they can reduce the population massively, and considering COVID is a smokescreen for the Great Reset, all part of Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030 of course, it gives me a great deal of concern for the contents of the upcoming mandatory COVID-19 vaccine that the entire population are supposed to take. Think about it. Globalists want to vaccinate all of humanity against a virus that isn't any worse than a flu, and they're also concerned about there being too many people on the planet. Just have a think about that for a moment. Here's an article from the World Economic Forum, who we know are behind the Great Reset, and it reads, "To build back better, we must reinvent capitalism. Here's how." This article was from the 13th of July 2020. The pandemic has brought into focus many of the vulnerabilities in our systems and institutions, but it also offers us a chance to shape a more resilient and sustainable world. How convenient that a pandemic came along to help you do that. Here's how businesses and policymakers can start building the green and inclusive future we need. Ooh, how utopian. Thanks to the ongoing pandemic, thanks to the ongoing pandemic, the world is off balance, and it will remain so for years to come. Problem, reaction, solution, order out of chaos. Far from settling into a new normal, we should expect a COVID-19 domino effect, triggering further disruptions, positive as well as negative, over the decade ahead. Here's another World Economic Forum article, How to Build Back Better After COVID-19, from the 3rd of April. We must all step up to respond to the challenges posed by COVID-19. We must come together with compassion and humility. We can build back better by ensuring long-term stimulus increases resilience and tackles the threat of climate change. This article from the World Health Organization is dated the 1st of October 2020. The best time to prevent the next pandemic is now. Countries join voices for better emergency preparedness. COVID-19 will not be the world's last health emergency, and there is an urgent need for sustainable health emergency preparedness to deal with the next one. It's almost like they know something that we don't. This was the strong sentiment shared by participants of the United Nations General Assembly side event on sustainable, there's that word again, sustainable preparedness for health, security and resilience, adopting a whole-of-society approach and breaking the panic then forget cycle, because obviously we have to remain panicked, I guess. Fear is a great way of controlling people. The high-level virtual event was co-hosted by Finland, France and Indonesia, along with the World Health Organization. And when we get to the last couple of paragraphs of this article, closing the event, Dr. Michael Ryan, Executive Director, World Health Emergencies Programme, appreciated the participants' remarks and asked for them to be met with sustained commitment to preparedness. We cannot let the world forget, because the next one may not be anything but the worst one, he said. This COVID-19 may just be a harbinger of what may come. We are living with too much risk. Again, sounds like some people know things that we don't know. This event marked a crucial dialogue among countries, donors and participants on building back better for future emergency preparedness during the current COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. It comes on the heels of the release of a sobering report by the General Preparedness and Monitoring Board that also called for urgent action in this area. You might be slowly starting to see a pattern here. Here's an article from the United Nations website, and this was from the 22nd of April. Climate change and COVID-19. UN urges nations to recover better. We need to turn the recovery into a real opportunity to do things right for the future, United Nations Secretary General. With this restart, a window of hope and opportunity opens. An opportunity for nations to green their recovery packages and shape the 21st century economy in ways that are clean, green, healthy, safe, and more resilient, UN Climate Chief. As the world begins planning for a post-pandemic recovery, the United Nations is calling on governments to seize the opportunity to build back better by creating more sustainable, resilient, and inclusive societies. My good lord, this is transparent. So, basically, they had a utopian vision for the future. It involves controlling all human life and all nation-states through their communist climate change cult agenda policies, but their plans weren't being accepted fast enough, so they created a manufactured crisis as a cover, as a Trojan, to accelerate their plans, COVID-19, and it helped them crash the world economy and tear apart the fabric of society and all public life in order to rebuild society and the economy in a way that helps them achieve their communist climate change cult agenda.
It's well worth subscribing to Spiroskouras. He does fantastic work on this whole crisis and on Agenda 21. I'm going to include some clips from one of his recent videos here, and he's done a great job on this.
Now, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the Hegelian dialectic, which is problem, reaction, solution. If you have a goal of, let's say, global governance, you may not be able to just roll this out because you'll be met with resistance, and there may be little to no justification for this agenda. So you engineer a crisis, in this case a global health pandemic, a scenario we have seen wargamed in documents such as the 2010 Rockefeller Lockstep document and Event 201, the tabletop exercise and simulation of a global coronavirus pandemic. that was sponsored by the World Economic Forum, Johns Hopkins, and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which took place last October. This crisis, which I believe to be engineered, produces a desired response: a controlled demolition of the global economy, wiping out the middle class, creating more dependency upon the government in the form of stimulus money and bailouts, which essentially equate to ownership.
Absolutely spot on. And at this point, I want to alert you to an interview that I did with economist Ernst Wolf back in April, in case you didn't see it, which was about the controlled collapse of the global financial system. That's also linked below.
We experienced the authoritarian lockdowns, which was the conclusion of the Rockefeller Lockstep document on how to mitigate this crisis.
This is very important. The Rockefeller document from 2010 on page 18 talks about a possible pandemic which led to a world of tighter top-down control and effectively a police state where people sacrificed their freedom for more security. Think about this. If this COVID virus really was a genuine Spanish flu, why would we upend our entire lives and radically alter our societies and our way of doing things forever? At the time of the Spanish flu between 1918 and 1919, there was 1.6 billion people on planet Earth. The Spanish flu killed 50 to 60 million people. 500 million people were infected. That means that there was no need to enforce lockdown and quarantine because the virus was so deadly that its effects were manifestly observable when people opened their front doors. Everybody knew someone who was very sick with it, and everyone knew someone who had died from it. Everyone just chose to quarantine by themselves because it was fairly obviously a clear and present danger. If the people have to be forced into a lockdown, however, supposedly for their own good, like we were, and healthy people are being quarantined, and yet most people don't know anyone who's died from this thing, it should be a dead giveaway that something is up. After the Spanish flu had killed tens of millions of people, life went back to normal. Police states and Orwellian social distancing didn't become the new norm. So, as you can see, it's obvious to those with functioning brain cells that this crisis was created to serve as an excuse to acclimatize the public into a new way of living and bring about a new world order.
The solution was just announced by the World Economic Forum, the same World Economic Forum who asked Johns Hopkins to host Event 201. Their solution is what they are calling the Great Reset, an initiative that was officially launched this week. Now, the Great Reset is not a new idea that they just made up over the weekend, okay? This is a long-standing global governance agenda which ties into the United Nations 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which seeks to regulate, control, and redefine all aspects of life as we know it. And in June of last year, the United Nations and the World Economic Forum formed a strategic partnership to accelerate the implementation of the UN 2030 Agenda. Now, here is a quote from the World Economic Forum about the Great Reset, directly from their website. In fact, one silver lining of the pandemic is that it has shown how quickly we can make radical changes to our lifestyles. Almost instantly, the crisis forced businesses and individuals to abandon practices long claimed to be essential, from frequent air travel to working in an office.
It's almost as if this entire crisis was manufactured to help the UN to achieve their goals. Huh.
Back in January of this year, 2020, the World Economic Forum founder and executive chairman Klaus Schwab was asked, what can we expect to be the focus of Davos 2020? And he referenced his book from 1970 on a new economic model called stakeholder capitalism.
Well, thank you so much. And of course, it's the headquarters of the World Economic Forum, which is celebrating 50 years as its founder. What does that mean to you personally?
It doesn't mean celebrating 50 years of Davos or of our existence. For me, it means to celebrate 50 years of the stakeholder concept, of stakeholder capitalism, because I wrote the book in 1970 and conceptualized, probably for the first time, what we call today stakeholder capitalism. And I wanted to create a place where stakeholders could meet. And that was the original idea of Davos. So I'm very pleased and happy that we are not only celebrating 50 years, but we are celebrating now finally that stakeholder capitalism has become or is becoming mainstream.
When we look on the World Economic Forum's website, we see that stakeholder capitalism is one of the main objectives of this Great Reset. At the time of the interview back in January of 2020, the stock market was at all-time highs, and the sense of urgency for a new economic model really wasn't there.
I see also, I would call it, that we have urgency in emergency related to the environmental issues, climate change, but also biodiversity and so on. We face an emergency situation, and we have not yet really the sense of urgency to address those issues. We see it now with the fires in Australia, and of course it's relatively difficult to get such a sense of urgency if the stock markets are doing so well as we see now.
Now we have economic conditions comparable to that of the Great Depression due to the fallout from the coronavirus lockdowns. And now, lo and behold, we have the justification for the Great Reset and the 50-year-old plan for the new economic system. Now, just 3 days ago, the World Economic Forum hosted a virtual summit for the Great Reset. Attendees included Klaus Schwab, the founder of the World Economic Forum, the United Nations Secretary General Guterres, Prince Charles, the head of the International Monetary Fund, and a top representative from MasterCard, among many others. And the general consensus was that we cannot afford to miss this window of opportunity to implement the Great Reset because COVID has shown our current system to be broken.
The COVID-19 crisis has shown us that our old systems are not fit anymore for the 21st century. It has laid bare the fundamental lack of social cohesion, fairness, inclusion, and equality. Now is the historical moment, the time, not only to fight severe virus, but to shape the system for the need for the post-corona era.
The post-corona era, comrades. The revolution is within our grasp. A world of insert nice-sounding and completely unrelated words here.
According to the World Economic Forum website, the Great Reset agenda would have three main components. The first would steer markets towards fairer outcomes, aka wealth redistribution through taxation and regulation. The second component of the Great Reset agenda would ensure that investments advance shared goals, such as equality and sustainability, aka there will be global standards regulated by task forces to control every aspect of your life through regulation and ensure compliance to the 2030 agenda.
Like I said, you can clearly see that the populace are already being groomed into a world where they simply follow orders. Next, Spiro talks about the fourth industrial revolution, which I will discuss in a moment.
The third and final priority of the Great Reset agenda is to harness the innovations of the fourth industrial revolution to support the public good, especially by addressing health and social challenges, aka this is the transhumanist agenda to merge man with machine and enforce compliance with global governance initiatives laid out by the UN's 2030 agenda. Now, this might be a good time to note that 14 of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals include vaccination.
I'm not going to talk about mandatory policy and where I stand on that point. It may well come up later, kind of hoping it does in the questions, because then I'll share with you my rather one-sided opinion on that. So what could be a better return on investment, Rob? What could we invest our resources in if we're not going to tackle hesitancy? If hesitancy is not to blame, how are we going to deal with this in the future? Well, I would argue that now is the time when we need a shift in perspective. Immunization is a best buy. 14 of 17 SDGs are addressed through immunization. And when we talk about universal health coverage, we talk about primary health care, we talk about health security. Without immunization, there's none of that.
Yeah, vaccines are going to be mandatory, just like the face masks.
Part of the Great Reset is simply a massive wealth transfer from the middle class to the 1% of the 1%. Crashing the economy is achieved by making it simply impossible for most small to medium businesses to continue. The social distancing rules, restrictions and lockdowns will eliminate most small shops, pubs, restaurants and other businesses, and this in turn benefits major corporations who will just buy up all the properties that those businesses used to reside in. Competition is killed off and monopolies become widespread. In the future, there will only be large corporations and government-run businesses, the essence of economic fascism. The Irish government is doing everything in its power to ensure that small business owners go under in a slow burn, controlled demolition of the economy. Once most people have been reduced to dependence upon the state and welfare handouts, they will be easy to control because the government will dictate the terms by which people will receive that welfare. Eventually, social welfare will become universal basic income, and that will be attached to the caveat of no jab, no pay, no vaccine, no money, no vaccine, no food. Technologies like health passport apps are being promoted as systems that will become the means by which people will be permitted to move around and engage in society. If a government can declare a fake crisis and then coerce you and your family into being injected with a substance with contents you cannot inquire as to the safety of, then your body is forfeit in the hands of the state. They could literally inject you with anything. They effectively own you. The face masks have already been a powerful way of achieving compliance and acquiescence to groupthink and the elimination of individual human rights. The rights of the collective now come first. When the global economy collapses and our currencies become worthless, new digital currencies will be offered, which will be closely tied to a China-style social credit surveillance state. It's quite simple. Did you post so-called misinformation online? You're a naughty citizen, and you'll lose some points. Did you fail to wear a face mask in the shops? That's a few more points lost. Keep this up, and you won't be allowed to travel, or you'll receive on-the-spot fines that will come straight out of your bank account. The new global currency will be cashless, which means every transaction can be tracked, and therefore taxes and levies can be added at any time. All human movements will be known and traceable, and some transactions can be stopped, and people can be cut off of the digital economy as punishment for political dissent. This is why there was a lockdown. This is why the economy is deliberately being destroyed, to build a new digital prison world out of the dust of the old world. There's nothing about the phrase new normal that suggests it's going to be temporary. It's not the new temporary. Normal suggests permanence. As this CNN article writes, there is no getting back to normal, experts say. The sooner we accept that, the better. Well, I guess if an expert says it, it must be true. Yet more propaganda programming to try to convince people to accept this dystopian world that offers no freedom, no privacy, and ultimately no meaning. By the way, as you know, the World Economic Forum has been talking about the Great Reset and how COVID factors into it for months now. And it now appears that there's a website dedicated to the Great Reset, greatreset.com. And the website has the following. The pause during lockdown created by the pandemic will result in a 7% decrease in global emissions in 2020. The UN states that we need a decrease of 7.6% every year until 2030 to avoid climate and ecological disaster. This means we need to maintain the same decrease every year as if we were living in lockdown. Do you see now why the lockdown was extended beyond 2 weeks? Do you see now why it's still going, ladies and gentlemen? The challenge is that as we emerge from the pandemic, the pressure to go back to business as usual will intensify. But people don't want to go back, huh? Only 23% of the UK public believe following lockdown, advertising should encourage people to consume, shop and fly like before lockdown. 77% believe it is the industry's responsibility to encourage people to behave more sustainably, like during lockdown. I guess it's going to be a lot easier to bring about such widespread global changes when economic power is going to rest with only a handful of massive corporations. Perhaps that's why all small businesses are slowly being made unsustainable. All makes sense, doesn't it? The Great Reset is a creative industry movement to embed the positive environmental shifts that happened during lockdown as the new normal. Getting it yet? Our industry has power and influence, but we need lots of people to choose to use it. We must grab this opportunity to help shape a society that puts mankind and our planet's needs first. To do this, we need to reset ourselves to become agents of change, not just passive receivers of briefs. Reset our work so what we create promotes sustainable values, attitudes, and behaviors. Reset our impact by re-evaluating what we measure and celebrate as success. So, this is what COVID-19 was all about. As Rosa Corey, author of Behind the Green Mask, has said, the climate change narrative wasn't working by itself. It needed a push. It needed an accelerant in order to create the kinds of restrictive societal and economic conditions that were conducive and compatible with the kind of world that the climate change fanatics want to create. Telling people that the planet was dying for decades with no proof simply wasn't working. They needed to scare humanity into compliance with the green agenda by masking the agenda itself with the cover of a more immediate and existential threat. So they used the fear of a virus in order to achieve the same goal: reducing human activity and movement via lockdowns and restrictions, and then the creation of a new normal, basically the continuation of the same behaviors and actions that the public learned and adapted to throughout the COVID crisis. One of the plans I've heard is that everyone's carbon footprint will be recorded via the next generation of tracking and health apps, so that everything we consume and our impact upon the environment can be quantified and managed. The future is a world where the globalists can determine our daily caloric intake and how much of a burden we are on the environment. You know what's interesting? We know that the World Health Organization is an arm of the United Nations, and it's the UN that's really in control of our governments right now. But they've been saying for quite a while that we need to reduce global emissions by 7.6% every year for the next decade to meet 1.5 degree Paris target. Huh. That was written on the UNenvironment.org website back in November of 2019. Huh, you don't say. So isn't it interesting how the Great Reset website talks about how the lockdowns have helped to reduce global emissions by 7%? There is no way that the draconian control measures we're seeing being introduced around the world have anything to do with stopping a virus. COVID is an accelerant for the global communist regime that is the climate change agenda. This article is from the World Health Organization. World Health Organization Director General's opening remarks at the media briefing on COVID-19, 7th of September 2020. Today is the first International Day of Clean Air for Blue Skies. The pandemic and the measures taken in many countries to contain it have taken a heavy toll on lives, livelihoods, and economies, but there have also been some unexpected benefits. In many places, we have seen a significant drop in air pollution. It's almost like that was the intent of the lockdown and keeping people in their homes. Here's another article from them. World Health Organization Director General's opening remarks at the media briefing on COVID-19, 21st of August 2020. In particular, the pandemic has given new impetus to the need to accelerate efforts to respond to climate change. Why? How could they possibly be connected? Well, because COVID-19 is an excuse to bring about the climate change agenda. The pandemic has given us a glimpse of our world as it could be. Clearer skies and rivers. Are you starting to get it yet? Less people knocking around the world equals good, according to the World Health Organization. Building back better means building back greener. In May, World Health Organization published our manifesto for a healthy and green recovery, with 6 policy prescriptions for protecting nature, investing in water and sanitation, promoting healthy food systems, transitioning to renewable energy, building livable cities, the smart cities we're supposed to live in, the human habitat zones, because we're not going to be allowed to go to the rest of the country, and stopping subsidies on fossil fuels. In other words, they want to control the means of production, like communists tend to do. So the populace of planet Earth just wasn't going to go along with the climate change agenda and wasn't convinced that major social and economic changes were needed in order to reduce our global carbon emissions by 2030. 2030, of course, being the target for Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So a plan was hatched to trick the public into compliance with the climate agenda. The reason the term new normal is used is because it refers to all the ways in which human behavior and quality of life must be modified in order to be in compliance with the climate change policies, such that a 7.6% annual reduction in emissions can be achieved for the next 10 years. This should make it clear that our freedoms were never supposed to come back, and that our lives are not supposed to go back to normal, because this was never about dealing with an actual pandemic, but in fact, it was about the other globalist scam of climate change. This is why last year and the year before, we've been seeing an increased number of articles from major publications about how, in the Western world, we might soon have to start adding insects to our diet in order to help fight climate change. This, of course, is preparation for extreme poverty and food shortages. I'm seeing a lot of articles like this lately. Last year, The Guardian ran with this: would you give up having children to save the planet? Meet the couples who have. The environmental toll of having even one child is enormous, 58.6 tons of carbon each year. So is going child-free the answer to our climate crisis? The year before, they ran with this article. Want to fight climate change? Have fewer children. Next best actions are selling your car, avoiding flights, and going vegetarian, according to a study into true impacts of different green lifestyle choices. Here's an article from Newsweek. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez asks, is it still okay to have kids in face of climate change? I'm seeing this kind of stuff more and more, and in addition, there's also a lot of articles talking about how in the future, we're all going to have to get used to eating insects. CNN has published articles like this. To feed the world, begin with maggot sausage and insect ice cream, scientist says. I covered this in a previous episode of How Is This a Thing? Here's an excerpt. Good old climate change, the bogeyman excuse for raising taxes and now adding insects to our diet. Doesn't the future look so amazing? Packed with protein, yes, and they're also eaten in extremely poor countries where if they had the choice, they probably wouldn't eat them. Just as a quick aside, socialism in Venezuela has created such massive inequality and made people so unbelievably poor that they've been forced to eat the pigeons and rats in the streets. Also, some people have even broken into zoos in order to eat the animals. If people in the Western world have to one day begin eating insects to survive, it will mean that the middle class will have completely disappeared and the ruling class will continue to become richer. The mega-wealthy oligarchs will continue to live in luxury and eat all the sushi, steak, linguine, caviar, and avocado toast they want, while the rest of the serfs and wage slaves will be chowing down on crickets and cockroaches and struggling to pay rent in a cycle of increasing poverty, taxation, and massive inequality. Sounds delightful. Imagine a future where this becomes a real possibility. Let them eat cake. Well, cake is pretty luxurious. Look, guys, I know that quality food is now in short supply, but good news! If you change your definition of what you consider to be food, then there's lots to eat. All you have to do is go down to the rockery in your back garden, and it's like a veritable banquet of bugs. Our politicians are not going to come to their senses. Western democracies are now officially vassal states. They don't serve the interests of the public. They are diametrically opposed to their people. They serve the one world government, the United Nations, and international banksters. We only get out of this situation through mass non-compliance and civil disobedience, and for that, a lot more of the public will need to be awake. At a certain point, the Irish people will have to experience a moment of personal intuition and critical thinking, which they've been deprived of, given the sheer saturation of media propaganda for the past 7 months. Everyone was told back in March that they would see deaths in their own families from COVID, but that never happened, and it seems absurd, of course, to even say that. And they collectively began to forget these terrifying media messages as the months went by. The public were shown videos of people dropping dead in the streets of Chinese cities, but that's never happened anywhere in Ireland this year. At what point do people twig that something is not right? Possibly when they realise the most uncomfortable truth of all, that there is something much more terrifying than a virus going on here. They would have to acknowledge that their government is not just untrustworthy, but is in fact their enemy. The people would have to accept the reality that the politicians and so-called journalists and medical experts who stare down the camera lens are actually lying to their faces, and that the intent of their deception and propaganda is as malicious as any despot who has used such tactics in the worst dictatorships throughout human history. That would be something unbearable and perhaps even too outrageous for most people to accept. They would much rather believe that at worst, the government is merely incompetent and they've chosen the wrong strategy to deal with this crisis, rather than acknowledge that our government are nothing but puppets of nefarious, unaccountable international entities that no one elected and who are motivated by a thirst for totalitarian control. This is simply too much for most people to process, so instead it's easier to live in denial. From the polls that I've seen online, it appears that the vast majority of the Irish public seem to believe that a second national lockdown is needed. So basically, they have failed to engage their brains for the past 7 months. That's not to say we haven't made progress, because clearly we have.
but it looks like the Irish public at large are desperate for more punishment from the government, or at least they're willing to accept life under level 3 restrictions for now. The story of why Irish people are so utterly, morally and spiritually rudderless is a long one, but I believe our fate was sealed in the abortion referendum of 2018. Stay with me, it is all connected. When Irish people voted overwhelmingly in a landslide referendum result to legalise the murdering of the unborn, they chose to embrace the tyrannical rule of man, rather than the moral law of God. The people decided to rationalise the dehumanisation of a section of the populace, the unborn, and in doing so they made the medical experts and health authorities their moral arbiters. Suddenly, "thou shalt not kill" no longer applied in Ireland. Now, so-called experts are the high priests of this new secular and woke Ireland. So it can hardly be surprising that eventually it would be the entire Irish populace that would find themselves dehumanized by the very moral arbiters that they had endorsed. Because the precedent of dehumanization was set, it would eventually find another target: the Irish people themselves. This is always a slippery slope. The justification of the marginalization and dehumanization and murder of one group of society leads inevitably to the same thing happening to another group. Irish people voted to kill the future, and now Irish society is dying as a result. An Irish people that believes in an optimistic and enlightened vision of the future would never have voted to destroy its own people, its most precious and vulnerable section of the populace, its offspring. But they did. And so now Irish people accept enslavement because this is a society that has embraced death. They have lost connection with the transcendent. Thousands of people will die from suicide as a result of the lockdown and job losses. Thousands more will die from delayed cancer treatments. If society was functioning and the people had not lost their ability to morally and intellectually reason, they would have reached the conclusion that most every human being on the planet once knew intuitively, that solitary confinement for long periods of time and this anti-human social distancing and fear of human contact and preventing people from getting the medical care they need is a recipe for the complete destruction of mental and physical health and the human spirit, and significant increases in death. This is torturous. But when a people have lost their way and their conscience, and unspeakable barbaric practices like abortion have already been normalized in a society, I think it's just a matter of time before tyranny and the worst atrocities known to man become possible. This would not have happened several decades ago, before Irish people were culturally, morally and spiritually compromised by modernism, nihilism and secular globo homo. There's a derangement and a callousness now that has descended on this island. Where's the empathy for the suffering of business owners now reduced to economic ruin? Where's the justice for those who died from suicide? Where's the outrage for the elderly abandoned in care homes so that COVID death numbers could be increased? Where's the outrage that those same elderly were left to die alone and afraid without their loved ones next to them to hold their hands and to tell them one last time that they loved them? Where's the consideration for the future suffering yet to come from these lockdowns? And the next target in the progressive agenda is the introduction of assisted suicide, which of course is a euphemism for euthanasia of the elderly. So that will be the unborn and the very old who will have been dehumanized. All of the barbarity we're seeing today becomes possible when Irish people decided that an innocent baby no longer deserved the right to life. What I'm saying is, life has been made cheap in Ireland in recent years. Human life has been cheapened. Therefore, if murder is on the table and Irish people have become so morally bankrupt that they will rationalise it, then of course they'll find a way to rationalise enslavement. They start by cheapening life itself. Removing the right to life for the unborn is the first step, and then quality of life for the living is the next thing to be cheapened. The precedent has been set when some people's right to life is forfeit, and therefore you've established the idea that rights can be removed in the first place. So it's no wonder then we're now living in a time when all of our human rights have been compromised. It was always eventually going to come for the rest of us. Men like Bill Gates have promoted abortion services in developing countries for many years. You're probably aware that his father was on the board of Planned Parenthood. He also has the Bill and Melinda Gates Institute for Population and Reproductive Health.
First, we've got population. The world today has 6.8 billion people. That's headed up to about 9 billion. Now, if we do a really great job on new vaccines, healthcare, reproductive health services, we could lower that by perhaps 10 or 15%.
These people believe that murdering babies is fine, so don't be surprised if they start promoting torturous ideas on the rest of humanity, like lockdowns, social distancing, prolonged isolation, and conditions that will lead to economic poverty and state dependence, because it's at that point that they can finally do whatever they want to you. For months, we've talked about the data and stats, and we've debunked the COVID narrative from every conceivable angle, but it doesn't seem to compute with Irish people. And I think it's because they've been convinced to outsource their morality and critical judgment to the state. They trust the government and the medical experts to be sort of surrogate parents for them. The globalists wanted to legalise abortion of children as part of their plan to reduce the population, and now that they've achieved that, there's one goal remaining: mass vaccination of the entire population of humanity. Boy, I sure hope those two things aren't connected. When a people reject the moral law of God, they will clamour for the authority of man instead, and that only ever leads to tyranny and suffering. Most Irish people appear to therefore lack the wisdom and discernment needed to separate reality from illusion, truth from fallacy, good from evil. The minds of Irish people have become so deranged that they actually accept the premise that everyone around them, even if they have no symptoms, is likely carrying a deadly disease and should therefore have their rights stripped from them and be forced to wear a cloth bag on their face. This is despite the fact that outside of the constant reinforcement of the COVID narrative in the mainstream media and some social distancing signs and stickers, they have no actual evidence from their own life experience that they're living in a pandemic. They believe that thousands of small businesses should be obliterated, without understanding that the destruction of the economy will drive people into poverty and that poverty destroys health anyway. They believe that people should treat each other like pariahs and stop shaking hands and hugging. They believe that limiting people's movements from their home during lockdown to 2 or 5 kilometres was acceptable. A €9 meal in a pub will save you from COVID. You can drink in the pub for 1 hour 45 minutes, but a second longer and the virus will suddenly go postal and come after you. You can eat outside in a restaurant's outdoor seating area, but if you eat inside, the COVID will come after you. If you're on public transport, you have to wear a mask, except if you're eating, because then COVID will leave you alone. And it's apparently acceptable for elderly people to die on their own with no family around them. This isn't just mass hysteria. It's the thinking of a people who, under any other set of circumstances, would be deemed clinically insane. Everyone in society is effectively treated like a criminal if they refuse to comply with an ever-expanding laundry list of government mandates that either make no sense, have no basis in scientific reality, or that often contradict each other in different settings. As we've discussed, the PCR testing for the virus is garbage, but even without a test, Irish citizens no longer enjoy a fundamental right to the presumption of innocence. By not complying with the rules, it's presumed that you must be a potential dangerous bioweapon for some hypothetical person somewhere, or that you're the one who's contributing to the ever-growing number of cases. But in reality, the cases are only rising because there's more testing facilities being set up throughout the country, thus adding to the case-demic. But apparently everyone is now potentially guilty of the pre-crime of getting someone somewhere sick unless they comply with the government mandates. And nobody can see that, actually, it's not really about controlling a virus, it's simply about controlling the people. It's sort of as though COVID is like an illicit substance, and even without a test, a person is assumed to be in possession of this substance within their own bloodstream. As James Corbett has described it, it's like after 9/11 in the US, with all the scaremongering about everyone being a potential terrorist. But now, during this pandemic, everyone is now a potential asymptomatic carrier of a deadly infectious disease and should therefore be treated as if they're a danger to the community. It seems that the Irish people en masse are unable to see the absurdity and injustice that they're living through. They cannot see what is right in front of them. They're living under totalitarian control. They live in what is effectively a police state. There's still time to disrupt this COVID narrative in Ireland and get our country back to resembling some degree of normality. But in the long term, the Irish people will need to reconnect and rediscover who they once were and what they once believed. Ultimately, the rejection of God has led to dangerous technocrats and power-hungry politicians trying to take his place, and the people now hang on their every word, subservient to their demands and terrified of their brutal control. They've weaponized the fear of death against the people, and in so doing, they have convinced them to do everything in their power to avoid it, including accepting the slavery that we're currently enduring. The government is not going to listen to the people. They listen to the globalists, the UN, the world's predatory banking cartels, the pharmaceutical industry, the World Health Organization, and vested interest groups that we didn't elect. Make no mistake, this battle will not be won solely with courtroom arguments and appeals to reason and the correct science and data. This is a spiritual battle that is won and lost in the hearts of men. The Irish government and the mainstream media will continue to fill the Irish people's heads with fear and threats. They will never provide them with what they truly need. They will never give them that which will fulfill them and enable their emancipation and liberty, that which they have lost, that which they must find again, that which they can rediscover in the midst of this darkness and despair, the salvation of our Lord and Saviour, Jesus Christ. Forget the corrupt Catholic Church that has abandoned us and that has acted against the interests of the Irish people for decades. The kingdom of God is inside you, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. The truth is the word, and the word shall set us free. Make no mistake, it doesn't matter if you've never believed in a higher power. If you can see the truth of reality around you, and you can recognize evil for what it is, then you have a gift from God, a divine talent given to you that you must not waste. Those of us who know the truth have an obligation to plant a seed in the minds of other people, and I pray that it helps to grow into a truly global awakening.